Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining our broadcast today. Today is Thursday, March 18th. This is our second refresh message this week. I'm Pastor Steve Green. Let's read Galatians 2, verses 20 and 21. Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Verse 21, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. We saw yesterday that the Corinthians were in danger of receiving the grace of God in vain by adopting a natural lifestyle. If we could use the word religious in a positive way, the Corinthians were not being religious enough. They just thought, well, we've been saved by Christ, and now we just go ahead and live, and God will bless us. And by doing that, they were setting aside or receiving the grace of God in vain. They weren't using it. And the Galatians likewise were in danger of not using the grace of God, of setting the grace of God aside, but in an entirely different way, because whereas the Corinthians were not being spiritual enough, the Galatians were being too religious. They were adopting Jewish religion. And so both ways, even though they seem opposite, I think this is a fascinating point. I love this, is that two very different people, they're polar opposites, one not being religious at all, others being quite religious, and yet both are equally setting aside the grace of God, because the grace of God comes through receiving the words of Jesus. When we seize upon the grace of God, or we do seize upon the grace of God by responding to the love of Christ, it all centers around Jesus, believing that he loved us, as it says in Galatians 2, believing that he loved us and he gave himself for us. So we live by faith in him. We respond to his words. His words are a higher standard. We embrace the grace of God by embracing the words of Christ. Leviticus 19:18 said, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said in John 13:34, as I have loved you, love one another. So he set the higher standard. By embracing the words of Jesus, we embrace the grace of God. As Christ gains greater footing in our hearts, we can say with Paul that we no longer live, but Christ lives in us, Galatians 2:20, or Galatians 4:19, Christ is being formed in us. That is the way of life.